Good evening, everybody. Welcome to December and welcome to Human Energy Club's 12th general meeting. Glad you could all make it. Hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving. I know that the break always feels too short and we always want it to be longer, but winter break's just around the corner. A couple more weeks. All right, if you haven't already signed in, you can go ahead and the link is there. And then again, it'll be at the end of the slides too. We are recording so that those who can't make our regular meeting time can go ahead and watch them. If you have any concerns, feel free to let me know in the chat and we can discuss afterwards if there are any concerns. We're interested in starting a book club so that we can keep talking about sustainability topics over the winter break and continue those conversations into the spring semester. So if you're interested or if you have some reading materials or articles or anything that you think would be interesting for us to explore, feel free to let us know at the sign up form here. So you can let us know like what format you're interested in, and then if you have any reading materials to recommend, we'd love to hear from you. And then Kat has an announcement about the Minnesota Undergrad Research and Academic Journal.
Yeah, thanks. So this journal is the first and only undergraduate research journal at the University of Minnesota. We're run completely by students. It's a really cool thing. And so this spring, we are funding students to do community-based research in a bunch of different fields. So if you have a project that you would be interested in having funded with, a little over, well, we don't have the budgets quite figured out yet, but you tell us what stipend you need and we'll fund you to do that project. So for our club, probably more in the environmental justice area of it, but the applications are due at the end of December. And so that Z link right there, you can find the application link. And also if you have research that you'd like to publish, we also publish that, so you can submit that article or contact us at Mirage. But we're just looking to fund people to actually do important research.
Awesome, thanks, Kat. And then again, these slides will be posted. So if you want to check these links out later, you can go ahead and find them after the meeting. Awesome. And then after today's meeting, we've got just 2 more for the semester. So next semester, we're going to hear from one of our vice presidents, Megan, who's going to talk about climate change and forced migration. And then at the end of the semester, we're just going to reflect on everything that we've learned, all the different topics that we've covered, and play some games to finish out the semester on the last day of class. So look forward to seeing you there as well. And now today, to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Marcella-Windmuller Campione is a silviculturist, and her overarching research goals are to explore the underlying dynamics of forests, so how they develop or how they're impacted by current and future disturbances, and then to use that science to develop management strategies which allow the sustainable management of forest ecosystems in the face of a changing climate. Specifically, she strives to create knowledge which can be applied by foresters and natural resource managers locally, regionally, nationally, and globally to increase forest resilience for current and future threats while maintaining ecological and economic ecosystem services. Thank you for joining us, Marcella, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you to share your presentation.
Awesome, and thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I wish I could meet you all in person in a different time, but it's really great to see folks coming together and just continuing to form communities during this time. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing. Folks can see? Okay, awesome. I'm seeing head nods. So before starting the presentation, I want to acknowledge the lands of the University of Minnesota and Crosby Farms. We are on Dakota homelands, and especially an important current past part of the creation story for the Dakota people is Bedote, which is the confluence of the Minnesota and with Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. So just want to take a moment to acknowledge the lands that this study and the university reside on. Thank you. So let's talk about Crosby Farms and adaptive silviculture for climate change. And before I even get into this, I want to acknowledge and thank so many people, because this is a collaborative project. This is not my work. This is not any individual's work. This is the work of so many people, so many organizations, so many groups. And it's with that collaborative nature of this project that we're really able to do a lot of cool things, and we're just getting started on that. And this link will be up throughout a few slides, and I can pass along these slides too. www.adaptivesilviculture.org provides a highlight of a lot of these resources, as well as kind of this overarching concepts that we're going to be talking about. So a outline for my talk, we're going to set the stage. What is silviculture? What is adaptive management? And then climate change in Minnesota along floodplains. So kind of setting the stage of what led to this project and kind of where we are. And then this broader framework that is across the United States and has the first location starting this summer in Canada. So we're international with this network. And then talk about Crosby Farm, the first urban affiliate site, what it looked like pre-treatment, what we did, and some really, really early preliminary results. So silviculture and silviculturist, what is it? What does it mean? So silviculture is the art and science, and those are two really, really important words. And this definition is really Euro-American centric. So silviculture is the art and science of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, and quality of forest and woodlands to meet the diverse needs and values of landowners. I think it's really important to highlight there's science. So within North America, from that Euro-American perspective, we have over 100 years of science in how forests are managed. So different ecosystems, how forests regenerate, how they develop, how they're managed. And that is not accounting for the traditional ecological knowledge that goes back centuries within North America and Canada and other regions. It related to our indigenous tribes, First Nations, and how they manage the land and are managing the land. So there's this huge base of knowledge on the science of what these species are, how they develop. There's also an art, which I think is equally important, that each site is unique, each forest system is unique, and each system, each decision is a unique set of decisions. And those decisions are based on values and goals. So that's whether it's the landowner, whether it's society, if it's public land, whatever the ownership, those are based on society's goals. So it is a human-centric part of this, of what are our values, and whether that's timber production, whether that's climate adaptation, whether that's ecological functions, that's coming from our perception of the values for that land. And to me, silviculture, of course, is the center of the world, but this wasn't even made by a silviculturist. This was made by a biometrician. It needs a little bit of updating. It was made in the 60s/70s. So we don't see climate change. We don't see a lot of the social justice. We don't see a lot of these other aspects that should be updated and put in this. But silviculture draws on all these aspects. So it draws on forest law and history, the admin, the policies. It draws on botany, zoology, soil science, meteorology. All these aspects come together to form silviculture, which is making those decisions, developing management strategies. So my job, I get to interact with all of these people, which is just so awesome. So I get to interact in a truly interdisciplinary nature related to forest and forest ecosystems. So silvics is the base of silviculture. And basically it relates to what a tree's personality is like. So does it like a lot of light? What about the water? What about the pH of the soil? The formal definition is this life history and general characteristics. Again, that personality. So how they grow, how they develop, how they live, how they interact. So how they interact not only with their environment, but other species, wildlife, all these aspects. And just what they do over that lifespan, which is pretty cool. And so silviculture builds on that base. It has this foundation in understanding the trees, understanding the environment. So it's based in ecology, it's based in the site, it's based in our knowing of the system. And so if this sparks more curiosity, I teach a certification course for the Forest Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, called the National Advanced Silviculture Program. And we have a YouTube playlist, so it's got a bunch of kind of foundational information and other aspects. And it's probably one of the things that's most interesting is we have about some of our videos on silviculture terminology have over 2,500 views, which is just outstanding and just amazes me every time that there's 2,500 people that might have watched that. So now getting into adaptive management. So adaptive management isn't just within forestry, isn't just within ecology. Adaptive management is kind of within humans. It's life as we plan, as we do, as we evaluate, and we learn. That relates to our management and our thinking of forest ecosystem. So thinking about our plan, why are we managing, what are we doing, implementing that plan, and then of course that evaluation and that learning and adjusting. And that adjusting is becoming more and more continuous as climate change is now and will continue to be part of our decisions, part of the impact of forest ecosystems. So silviculture and adaptive management. So silviculture is that utilization of harvesting of different treatments, and that is to meet this desired future condition. So if you close your eyes, that desired future condition is basically what you think of that forest will look like in the future. So it's that picture. So the number of trees, the type of trees, the species, who's there, and what does this forest look like, and how does it look like? And this was a little naive of us in the past, but there was this want to control so that we could control and move the desired future conditions. Climate change, life, learning, all those aspects is throwing that out the window. And ecosystems, forests are complex. Climate change is making that even more so, that how the climate is changing, the extent, the severity, disturbance, frequency, all these interactions is putting us on a trajectory that we don't know what that future is going to look like. And so that requires adapting and being flexible and changing. And so climate change, Minnesota, I'm sure you all have so many resources. I'm just going to put another one out there. Climate Change Guide for Northern Minnesota Forests. It's produced by the University of Minnesota. And if we were meeting in person, there are these great little flip books. So I wish we were meeting in person so I could bring a few for you all. So climate change is changing. I'm just going to highlight one example with mean temperature. And while the annual, like overall, that 12-month period may not look super big or super different, what we're really seeing is those winter temperatures, those are going to change. Those are impacting our forests, and especially that minimum temperature. That could be a huge change to our systems, to our forests, to Minnesota. So let's talk about floodplains. Let's talk about climate change. So floodplain forests, if you've been along a river, if you've been along the Mississippi, those are the forests along the Mississippi and along rivers. They're floodplain forests. So they are adapted to high levels of flooding. They can have frozen or saturated ground. If you were here, if you were in Minnesota about 2 years ago, you might remember the high water year that we had, with just the Mississippi being super, super high. And so the species that live here are adapted to these sites. So they are adapted to saturated soils, frequent erosion, and that regeneration or that understory can be pretty open because it's a pretty harsh environment. So it takes the right combination of things to happen to allow regeneration or new seedlings to come in. So climate change is making that all the more interesting. And we'll talk more about this, but one of the big things up here is overall vulnerability is low to moderate. But take that with a grain of salt, because our confidence in these systems is pretty low. So we have limited understanding, limited evidence, and in general, the models, there's limited agreement. So what we're basing off of is a system that we really truly don't understand, and we truly are still learning about what is the base level of function, let alone what is the system functioning under climate change. So timing, level, intensity of flooding, precipitation, that's all expected to change. And especially with those extreme events, they can be really, really hard to predict exactly what that might look like. So extreme precipitation might mean extreme flooding and then long periods without precipitation or drought. We've also got changes to the rivers and how they've been dammed and how they've been influenced and those natural dynamics that shape these systems. Plus, this is a big one with invasive species like canary grass and European buckthorn. So when we talk about regeneration or creating space for new seedlings, often when we create that space, we're also creating that space for those invasive species. And they're really, really good at taking over that space. And this is just one example of kind of some of this information that we do know, but how variable it is with a species like black ash showing no change to high change to big decreases, and green ash showing no change to high change. But that's modeled without the impact of invasive species like emerald ash borer. So even if these species are potentially going to do well with climate change, there are so many other factors that are influencing these disturbance dynamics. So stepping away from Minnesota, I'm going to go into the adaptive silviculture for climate change, this national and now soon to be international network. So ASK is this large collaborative project, and it has sites across the United States and soon to be Canada. It's led by Dr. Linda Nagel, Dr. Chris Swanson, and Maria Genoviak. And the goal was, they were talking about 10 or 15 years ago, and within the management community, there continue to be these questions. Well, okay, climate change is happening, but what do? We see this theoretical stuff, but how do I actually implement it? And that became the goal of this, to show real life examples of implementing climate adaptive management and doing it in a way where it isn't just research delivering information to managers, but managers and researchers coming together to form those questions, to develop strategies, and create something that could be utilized both for the science and the understanding, but then really inform management, because managers are part of the group, they're on board, they are just as involved as the researchers. And so these are a few of the sites there. It's continually expanding, but these are a bunch of different locations. And we're lucky in Minnesota, so we have both the first urban adaptive site at Crosby Farm and the oldest site at the Cutfoot Experimental Forest on the Chippewa National Forest, established in 2013. I do think one of the interesting facts is this Cutfoot Experimental Forest has hosted a lot of people. So I'm guessing that site has probably hosted since 2013, 1,000 people. Crosby Farm has over 1,000 people in a few months. So the amount of people that are able to see this, be a part of this, is just magnitudes of more. These other sites are within national forests, within forest systems. And often when we think of forest resource, when we do forest research, we put it so it won't be disturbed, so it won't be part of the public. So we have these large expanses. And that's great, except that means that the public and people are not part of this. They're not able to experience it. They're not able to see it. It's for foresters, it's for forest researchers. But our forests are not just for researchers or foresters, it's for everyone. So it's really exciting to see urban sites coming online and having that connection with sites that are really part of a public location. So the design is, again, this collaborative research replicated on the ground And the goal is to provide scientific information. And there's 3 different areas. So resistance, think about pushing against a wall. So a wall of climate change is coming at you and you are pushing against it. You are trying to resist. You're trying to maintain stability. Resilience is the equivalent of like a rubber band. So there's some change and there's some flex, but you hope that rubber band kind of returns back to that previous state. Transition is saying climate change is happening. This is not going to look the same. Let's move into that new system. So let's facilitate that change. Let's encourage adaptation. And so I mentioned that there's all these multiple sites, there's all these locations. They all have a common theme of resistance, resilience, transition, and a no action. So that no action where no treatment is happening and the development of these systems is happening without any active management. They're all replicated, and there is monitoring and evaluation. And so we're talking about a minimum of 20-year evaluation window. So we're talking about a long time of investment of the site, just because with trees, that is 20 years is just a drop in the bucket for many of their lifespans. But what is different is each of the sites, each of the objectives, each of the approach, and each of like the goals and what this is. So with that, I want to transition over to Crosby Farms, which is the largest natural park in the St. Paul systems of parks. And it is right along the Mississippi River. So there's 2 parking lots right up here and then over here. And we'll be talking mostly in this area right there. And it is just a wonderful gem that we have within the region, within the city. So I like to start with this because this is Crosby Farms fall of 2019. And yes, it was after our first frost. So, but what you are seeing is a bunch of dead ash. So those ash were killed by emerald ash borer, and what you have left is this ghost forest where there are dead trees in the overstory, there are vines, there is very little new trees coming in. And so it's been within a relatively short period of time, there's been a huge shift in this system. There's been a huge change in the ecosystem. And that lack of regeneration, that lack of new trees led to a lot of questions of what do we do? How do we maintain this forest system? And what do we plant? And that what do we plant became a really big part of the questions among managers of which species do we survive? Do we plant the species that are here? Do we plant future adapted species? What does this look like? And from, here, before I get into the here's a little more information on what is killing these trees. And some of you may be familiar with the different color flagging that have EAB around ash trees across the Twin Cities. But emerald ash borer has been in the Twin Cities for a number of years. It's recently been discovered in Duluth. So it's expanding in Minnesota and just is in over 20 different states, multiple Canadian provinces, and is just really, really impacting our ash forests, our ash resource, especially not only in extensive rural forests, but urban forest as well. So emerald ash borer is a beautiful emerald green beetle. It really is beautiful if it didn't do so much damage here. And it's a big beetle. So this is the large view, but that's a large beetle. And what it does is it moves throughout the tree and girdles the tree, basically cutting off the food supply. And it does it relatively quickly and really efficiently. So there's a lot of research right now looking for ash trees that might have been able to survive EAB, might have some level of resistance, a lot of genetic programs looking at breeding to maintain our ash. But it is a really, really effective invasive species. And at Crosby Farms, the vast majority of those trees were ash, so over 95% of those trees. And those trees have mostly been killed. So a lot of those trees in the overstory are dead or dying. And that really brings up what's happening next and where that regeneration is going. And so the specific goals of this proposal is to test different effectiveness. So adaptation, growth, survival, phenology under a changing climate. So how does the system function? How can we introduce new trees? And what does that look like? And so we want to test short-term survival and growth of 14 different tree species, and we'll get into the different tree species. Influence how phenology, so when do they break bud, how do those leaves grow, when do they lose their leaves, how all those aspects influence their growth and development, and understand how the river and the microenvironment, so the flooding, the temperatures, if our southern species that we plant, can they survive the Minnesota winters? What is that like? And so prior to any of this starting, we collected pre-treatment data, and that goal is just to understand this ecosystem, this forest type, before any treatment happens. So Crosby Farm is over 600 acres. So we selected our area that we were going to be doing the study, which came out to probably about 100 to 200 acres. And we set out to put in plots and get a feel for what the forest is like, what the forest is out there. And that's how we came up with the amount and the percentage of the trees that had been killed by emerald ash borer. And as we were moving through, all those dead trees came, and we were able to see that there's a lot of gaps already forming. So the mortality from EAB with the ash was already creating mortality gaps. And so in designing the study, we utilized those already formed mortality gaps instead of creating new ones. So we utilized the gaps that are already there. Working in an urban environment creates lots of interesting challenges and also lots of interesting interactions. So Crosby Farm is a park that is so close to so many people's hearts. So any change to the system is going to come with questions. So why are you cutting down trees? Why are you changing that? And that that was there. So we formed these gaps, and we looked at where the gaps already were, and if there was enough for us to be able to utilize what was already happening, and also talked with managers of how they would regenerate the forest, of how they would manage. And so really focusing on making sure our study fit within both what was within the values of the park and the city, and also what could be done within managers with managers. So I mentioned getting this pre-treatment data, finding these gaps, and these red areas that you're seeing, those are the areas where we saw large levels of mortality. So we're talking about extensive areas of dieback, extensive areas that were uniform enough for our treatments, for our experiments, and areas that we could put in our experiment. And so we found 25 gaps. So we actually had one extra. So we are utilizing 24 of these gaps or locations, and had one just in case something ended up not working out. And so within each of the gaps, those dead overstory trees, those were removed. So not only from a safety standpoint, working around dead trees is really dangerous with wind and anything else, also to protect the deer fencing that went up. So we put in 8-foot tall deer fencing. So a down tree that is 12, 14, 16, 20 inches in diameter, that can do a lot of damage and can be really impactful to a deer fence, to a fence, and also to allow us to plant. So this allowed us to create a more uniform environment for us to plant under. So the site was cleared, and we had so much help from so many different organizations, with the Conservation Corps, with collaboration with Mississippi Park Connection, City of St. Paul, just so many organizations. And so once the gap was clear, then it became talking about species and what species to plant. And this was a huge part of this discussion because, again, this park, so many people have these memories, this is part of people's experience, part of their life. And so thinking about what species fit within this framework and also are within the values and goals for Crosby Farms. So with resistance, again, maintaining this unchanged condition. So we went with species that were on site: silver maple, American elm, cottonwood, hackberry, river birch, and these are all from the zone that we are currently in. So we are in plant hardiness zone 4. Our resilience, we moved a little farther south and opened the range of species. So looking at Wisconsin, Iowa, southern Minnesota, what are other species that occur along floodplains? So we have silver maple, American elm, cottonwood, black willow, river birch, bur oak, sycamore, and swamp white oak. And those are from plant hardiness zone 5. And you'll notice silver maple, we have silver maple in all the treatments from zone 4. So that's going to be one of our bases for comparison. So that way we can see and compare across the treatments, across the plots, to see if it's the plot that's influencing growth or if it's the actual individual trees. And also be able to compare, is there a difference between these zones? So are we seeing a difference between silver maple zone 4, silver maple zone 5, silver maple zone 6, and have those trees right next to each other within each of our plots. And then finally, transition, that is that active change and transition to climate change. And so we expanded this really far. So our trees came from Tennessee. So they came from Tennessee during a pandemic. So they had quite the ride. But we moved into silver maple, red maple, American sycamore, river birch, sweet gum, southern pin oak, honey locust, tulip poplar, and this is a really different system. These are southern bottomland species, and we're looking at what does that look like in Minnesota and in these floodplain systems. So we have our species, we have our site, and now it was setting up for about 1,200 seedlings. And in a few slides, you'll see that these seedlings aren't really seedlings. I mean, they're kind of trees. And so this was a really different experience for me because it was working with so many wonderful collaborative partners, and that the planting was done by volunteers. A lot of my previous experiences working within my lab, working within my researchers, and we're the ones planting the trees. This was a completely different experience. And so there was a lot of prep work to make sure the trees were labeled, the trees got to where they're going. And so a big shout out to Mike Tuma, who was the main researcher doing a lot of the setup and prep work. He made sure that each flag was labeled with the tree. So this is silver maple zone 4 going right in that spot. So we needed to know what tree was going in, where it was going in, and making sure each volunteer knew to match the tree with the flagging. And it worked, and we had just the most wonderful set of volunteers. And seeing people in masks is becoming so much more normal. So we planted during a pandemic. So there was so much planning that went in to make sure that what we were doing was safe and in a way that we could provide a safe and secure environment for our volunteers to be with us, to be in this environment. The nice thing is with forestry and planting, so we're outside and the trees are at least 10 feet apart. So we're talking about maintaining social distance basically from our planting scheme. Over a series of about 2 weeks, we planted just under 1,200 trees. And you can see Mike holding one of these trees, and these trees are not, again, 1 to 2 inches tall. They're 1 to 2 feet tall. They're 7, 8, 9 feet tall. These are large trees that went in the ground. And so one of those goals is if we put large trees in, can they better maintain the flooding? So if we have flood levels that are 1, 2, 3 feet above the surface and above the soil, if we have a larger tree, are they able to survive? Do they have a better developed root system? And so we planted them and they started to grow. And it was really, really exciting to see trees growing and developing and coming into these spaces that were filled with dead trees before. And you can see in the background some more of the dead green ash in the background. But the trees went in and they were ready and they were growing. And so throughout the summer, so the planting happened in spring, and throughout the summer, right after they got planted, we started recording information on them. And so each tree has their own tag. So the tag relates to a species, an individual tree, and we're going to follow those individual trees throughout for as long as we can. And so right after they got planted, we did a check. We did, how are they looking? Are we seeing green buds? Did they survive? Are they alive? And we did multiple checks throughout the summer. So we did 3 different checks to see, are they growing? Are they living? At the beginning of the season, we also measured height and diameter and vigor and all these other aspects to get really great quantitative data. And then at the end of the season, we do the same thing. So that way we can look at growth and we can look at survival. And so the most exciting thing is, I think a lot of these tree species survive. So 87% of the trees that we planted are alive, are growing, are part of the system. This is one of the transition plots. So you can see sycamore, silver maple, and those sycamore leaves, some of them are as big as dinner plates. They're just growing and doing so well. So the resistance and resilience treatment had high survival. So over all the plots in both of those treatments, we only had 32 trees die. So great survival. And that kind of makes sense. These trees are currently adapted to Minnesota or the general region. They're part of our system. They're part of this general floodplain. And so we had minor mortality with some cottonwoods and a few different species in the resilience, but really minor. We saw a lot more of that mortality in the transition treatment. So 77% of the mortality occurred in these treatments. And that was red maple, river birch, and tulip poplar. So that could have been due to transportation. So that movement from Tennessee to Minnesota, it could have been due to planting stock. It could have been due to a lot of reasons. And so there's a lot more data for me to dig into to understand when these trees died, if they were alive when they were planted, if they were dead when they were planted, and just kind of tease apart when did these trees die and try to figure out how that impacts our decision of what happens next. But we had great survival among sycamore and southern pin oak. And so there's lots next. So we're going to be looking at growth, how they grow the first year, height and diameter, temperature and moisture. So we've got temperature sensors out, we've got soil moisture, we have rain gauges. So we're really trying to understand the system and the environment and the microenvironment that these trees are going. And will they survive the Minnesota winter? That's a big if for some of our southern species. And then also the phenology. So with our southern species, we're looking at these different zones. So will zone 5 and zone 6, will they break bud earlier? Will they maintain their leaves later? Will that give them an edge? So will they be able to put more growth in? And then these interactions. These are novel systems that we're creating, especially this transition treatment. That's a novel system. So it's not only the interactions among the planted trees, but insects and wildlife. And what about influence to recreation? So all those aspects, we're changing a foundational piece, the tree species that are here, those tree species in the transition, those are different. Those are going to have cascading effects, and those interactions may be positive, may be negative. And that's something we really need to assess before we start making decisions of, yeah, we would recommend transitioning to climate adapted species. There's going to be other aspects that we need to think about, not only from the tree growth and survival, but the whole ecosystem and the function. And Mary, my wonderful collaborator and just friend, couldn't be here tonight. She was double booked, but there are wonderful opportunities to volunteer with Mississippi Park Connection. You can look at parkconnection.org/volunteer or email Mike, and they're doing it in really great, safe ways, including Mike setting up virtual tree identification. Also, the Crosby crew is turning into individual zones and individual people, so making sure that the volunteer experience can continue and be done in a really safe way with the situation we're at with COVID right now. And so with that wrapping up, this is a picture of us collecting our end of the year measurements. If you remember, it feels way back when in October, that snowstorm that hit us, we were out there collecting our end of the year measurements, and the sycamore tree still had its leaves on and was just doing fine. So we have a lot to learn. So we have a 2-decade project in front of us. We've got 1 year down. And there's just a lot of growing that these trees to do, and we just have a lot of learning to see how they develop, how they grow, and what those impacts are. And so with that, I can take questions if there's time and just have some conversation too. Awesome. I can stop sharing the screen too.
One of my questions that I was wondering about was like, what does like in-field like observation look like? Does that take place like on a weekly basis, or like how does that work?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it varies. So this year we weren't out there necessarily weekly. So after the trees were planted, there was crews out there about every day for about 3 weeks to get those initial measurements and then follow up with these other aspects of height and growth and survival. And then folks were out there maybe once a month kind of checking in. What we're thinking about doing next year is more on the phenology. So that will be a weekly, if not bi-weekly measurement, just to observe the trees and check in on them and see how they're growing and developing.
How big is like your team that does that?
Yeah, so it varies, and this is one of the things that has really benefit from having volunteers. So those end of the year measurements, that was all done in collaboration with volunteers. So we had two time slots during a day, so 2 4-hour time slots, and I think we had 10 or 11 volunteers just to maintain safety. And so there's 22 people out there collecting data, and it's something that I have not had the opportunity to experience as much on some of my other projects, and this has just been so valuable and just so rewarding to hear and get to meet so many different people.
I had a question. So with the data you collect on like how the trees are doing and how they interact with one another and just generally how they thrive in this environment, what do you guys end up doing with that data? Like, do you give it to groups to like plan for when climate change progresses further, or like, yeah, what do you guys do with it?
Yeah, so it goes out in published research, so it goes out in published studies. But the biggest thing is a lot of that data will be shared. So understanding will be shared in a variety of different forms. So there's the published research, which as a faculty member, that's kind of where I get my points from. And then since this is in collaboration with the management community, there's all kinds of different webinars, there's different talks, there's different white papers that we'll produce. And so some of these initial measurements, so after 3, 5, 7 years, we can start also looking at modeling. So modeling those trees into the future. So what those dynamics are going to be, what those growth is going to be, assuming what we have right now for a climate. But we can start looking at that and start developing some models and some recommendations. And one of the first recommendations, or one of the first observations we're seeing, is there's a few trees from that transition treatment that may not travel well, that may not logistically, even if they fit the system ecologically and could survive here, the transportation and the travel, that might be a deal breaker. So it's pairing both the scientific of how these trees grow with what the managers can or can't do, or how those logistics then feed into their decisions.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Valerie. What would you say is your favorite part of my job? Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's been building and forming these relationships with different individuals, different organizations. That is one of my favorite parts of what I do, and my discipline is I can't do my job unless I have an amazing team of interdisciplinary people working with. So I know a little bit about a lot of things related to forestry and forest ecosystems, and I focus on how that influences management and developing those practices. But that means I don't know everything about entomology or pathology or soils or policy or all these other factors. And so to be able to do an effective job and do effective research, that means I get to work with really, really amazing people. And I think the more minds, the more views, the more experiences that are in a room, that are in a group, only provides value to that research and brings it to a better level. So I guess I feel really lucky within what I do, and having a faculty position, that I have that freedom, and I have that's something that is prioritized for me. Yeah, of course.
So I have a question. So as students mostly of science and engineering in this group, what are ways that, since we're not experts in this field and most of us are not likely to study this in depth in our careers, what are ways that we can support these kinds of projects in terms of our own work and perhaps outside the workplace, right? So in our spare time, what are ways that we can help with these efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's organizations like Mississippi Parks and other Friends Group provide that foundation to be involved, to volunteer, to have those experiences. And I think part of that involvement, you all have a key part as engineers, as individuals, as scientists, about the scientific process, right? That's a huge factor right now, the scientific process of trial, error, adaptive management, that's part of the process. And so making that something that's normal, something that's part of what we do, what we experience as individuals, not only in an engineering field or in another scientific field, but within our natural ecosystems. And also, you all probably know better than most, change happens. Change influences our infrastructure, change influences our systems. And that means our natural forested systems too. They're not static, they're ever evolving. So I think a big part is just that continual reminder to folks that in all our systems, they're constantly changing and we're constantly experimenting. So you all bring a huge like wealth of information and knowledge on that scientific process and that experimentation. That's the same thing I do. It's just in a different system.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, feel free if there's other follow-up questions, if there's other things I can help with, support, whatever, please feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat pod. But it was wonderful chatting with you all, and thank you for allowing me to speak about this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marcella, for joining us. This